This is my true story. My son left home one chilly morning with his lunch pail, his thermos filled with hot coffee, and a promise to be right back for dinner. He was 25 years old, strong and dependable, kind-hearted, and completely certain about his future. I watched him drive away down our long gravel driveway, never imagining that would be the final time I saw his face in real life. Days slowly turned into weeks and months. Hope gradually became a daily habit we couldn't break. Then, 32 years later, the television revealed a truth I was never prepared to face. Before I share exactly what I saw on that screen, please tell me where you're watching from. And subscribe so this story reaches more people who need to hear it. It was November 8th, 1991, a foggy Wednesday morning in rural Pennsylvania. The sky hung low and heavy with clouds, but everyday life carried on just the same. My son, Lester, woke up before the sun, as he always did. He carried his mother's quiet determination and my own stubborn resolve. He poured himself a strong cup of coffee, tied his sturdy work boots, and gently kissed her goodbye while she prepared breakfast. I can still recall the warm smell of bacon frying, the faint crackle of the radio playing classic country tunes, and the warm smile he gave me when I reminded him to drive safely. He chuckled softly, promised he'd be home in time for supper, and that was the end of our ordinary morning. The front door closed behind him. His old Chevrolet truck roared to life, and the engine noise gradually faded down the winding road bordered by leafless trees. Lester had been employed at the automobile factory for almost 4 years by then, steadily saving money to buy his own house someday. He wasn't the reckless type, never one to wander off or seek out danger. He thrived on his simple routines, the same hearty breakfast each day, the same familiar route to work, arriving home at the exact same hour every evening. There was absolutely no reason to suspect this day would turn out any different. His mother stood on the porch, waving until his truck crested the hill and vanished from sight. She turned to me with a soft sigh and said, "He's growing up so quickly." I smiled in agreement and replied, "He's still our boy at heart." But as the morning wore on, an uneasy feeling settled in. The air felt thicker somehow, the quiet more oppressive than normal. By midday, a light drizzle began falling, cold and persistent, soaking the fields around our home. I spent most of the afternoon in the shed, repairing an old lawnmower while constantly glancing at my watch. When 5 o'clock arrived, I found myself staring down the driveway, fully expecting to see Lester's familiar blue Chevrolet pulling in. 6 o'clock passed, then 7. The rain tapered off, but a deep worry began building inside me. By 8, his mother was restlessly pacing the floor. She dialed the factory, and the shift supervisor delivered the words every parent dreads. Lester had clocked out at his usual time, and nobody had seen him afterward. His co-worker Ryan mentioned that Lester planned to head straight home as always. That was all the information anyone had. No arguments at work, no unusual behavior, no signs of trouble. He was simply gone without a trace. I tried to reassure her, suggesting perhaps his truck had broken down along the way, or he pulled over to assist someone in need. But as midnight approached, and our home remained eerily silent, I knew deep down that something terrible had occurred. The entire atmosphere felt colder, more unforgiving than before. She brewed a fresh pot of coffee, but neither of us could drink a sip. Every small noise outside, a twig snapping or a distant vehicle on the road, made her startle with hope. Around 2 in the morning, I grabbed my coat and announced I would search his route myself. I drove every single mile from our house to the factory, stopping at every gas station, every roadside diner, scanning every dark ditch my headlights illuminated. The roads were completely empty, unnaturally so. When I finally returned home just as dawn was breaking, she was still seated by the living room window, the same soft lamp glowing beside her, her hands trembling around a long, cold cup of coffee. I didn't need to utter a single word. My expression told her everything. That fateful morning became the dividing line in our lives, separating everything before from the endless after. Before, our home overflowed with laughter, holiday plans, and bright hopes for what lay ahead. After, there was nothing but endless waiting. His boots remained exactly where he left them by the door. His jacket hung untouched on its hook. His dinner plate sat unused on the table night after night. The warmth and life seemed to drain from our house forever. I didn't realize it at the time, but that was the day time truly stopped for us. Clocks continued ticking. Calendars flipped to new months, but nothing ever progressed. Each sunrise appeared identical to the last. Just one more day without Lester coming home. By the following morning, our initial calm had transformed into desperate action. His mother hadn't slept at all, her eyes red and swollen from crying and whispering endless prayers into the quiet darkness. I promised her I'd go out searching again, retracing every possible road and asking questions wherever I could. The sun was barely rising when I pulled out of the driveway once more, following the exact same path Lester had taken just 24 hours earlier. Every familiar mile now looked strangely altered, as if the world had changed overnight. I caught myself examining fresh tire marks in the muddy shoulders, desperately trying to determine if any belonged to his truck. The commute from our farmhouse to the factory usually took around 35 minutes along Highway 22, passing vast farmlands and the weathered Exxon station close to the turnpike entrance. I stopped there first, describing Lester to the attendant and asking if anyone had seen a young man in a blue Chevrolet pickup with Pennsylvania license plates. He shook his head regretfully, saying no one matching that description had stopped by since the previous morning. I purchased a cup of stale coffee I couldn't bring myself to drink and left it sitting untouched on the counter, my hands shaking uncontrollably. At the factory, the employee parking lot was already filling with trucks and workers in heavy coveralls. Several of Lester's friends recognized me immediately and fell silent as I approached. I didn't need to explain my presence. "Did he mention anything out of the ordinary before leaving yesterday?" I asked them one by one. They all shook their heads no, confirming he clocked out around 4:30 as usual. Said he was heading directly home. One coworker recalled seeing Lester walk toward his truck while whistling cheerfully. After that moment, there was absolutely nothing. No disturbances, no unfamiliar people lurking, no sounds of any struggle. It had been just another typical workday that ended in unimaginable cruelty. I thoroughly searched the entire parking lot for any sign of his Chevrolet, but it wasn't there, as if the ground itself had swallowed it up. I continued driving the lesser-used back roads for hours, pulling into every gas station and asking every passing motorist if they'd noticed a blue Chevrolet pickup truck. A few offered sincere sympathy. Others avoided eye contact, but nobody provided any useful leads. By early afternoon, I contacted the local police department. The officer who took my call sounded frustratingly nonchalant, explaining that adults often take short breaks from routine and suggesting I simply wait a couple of days. I insisted firmly that Lester would never just disappear like that. He didn't drink excessively, didn't gamble, and owed no debts to anyone. But the officer merely sighed and repeated that we should give it a little more time. Waiting even a day or two felt like being asked to hold my breath indefinitely. That same night, I drove the highway route yet again. My headlights pierced the deep darkness like desperate searching arms, reaching for something that simply wasn't there. I stopped frequently along the shoulders just to listen intently to the surrounding fields. Occasionally, I thought I heard the distant rumble of his engine or glimpsed movement in the shadows, but stepping out revealed only the whispering wind. At midnight, I drove directly to the police station and completed a formal missing person report. I provided every possible detail from memory: his exact height and weight, any distinguishing scars, the clothing he wore that day, the unique tone of his voice, even his distinctive walk. The duty officer recorded everything methodically, treating it like standard procedure rather than the devastation it truly was. His mother remained at home, refusing to sleep, insisting on keeping the porch light burning brightly in case Lester returned. That single porch light stayed illuminated for many years afterward. When I arrived back home that exhausting night, I didn't need to speak. The defeat on my face communicated everything. She collapsed emotionally then, not with loud sobs, but a quiet, hollow breaking that hurt far worse. I held her tightly, though I was shattering inside as well. It remains the longest night I have ever endured. Every minute stretched into eternity. Every outdoor sound sparked fleeting hope that quickly died. I sat motionless by the telephone, willing it to ring with good news that never came. When sunlight finally filtered through the windows, I fully accepted what my heart already knew. Something catastrophic had happened, and no amount of waiting would bring Lester back. The following weeks dissolved into a repetitive cycle of frantic activity mixed with profound silence. The police conducted their routine investigation, asking questions at the factory, reviewing attendance logs, interviewing all co-workers, and carefully examining the parking area for any overlooked clues. They discovered absolutely nothing. No skid marks, no fragments of evidence, no sign of his truck anywhere. It truly seemed as though the road had opened up and claimed my son entirely. We created hundreds of missing person flyers featuring his recent photograph. A handsome young man smiling confidently in a denim jacket, hair neatly combed, eyes still full of youthful optimism the world hadn't yet dimmed. We posted them on every telephone pole, every diner bulletin board, every gas station window from Pennsylvania clear down to Virginia. Kind strangers promised to stay vigilant. Some politely accepted extra copies, while others looked away uncomfortably. Public sympathy tends to fade rapidly when the missing person isn't someone you know personally. Local news channels covered the story briefly for several days, filming us on our front porch while his mother clutched one of Lester's old flannel shirts close to her heart. The evening anchors described it as a puzzling disappearance without leads. Then, inevitably, other bigger stories emerged and pushed ours into obscurity. Police divers searched nearby rivers multiple times, finding nothing. They checked every hospital, morgue, and rest area in the region. Still nothing surfaced. Every anonymous tip ultimately led to dead ends. Some late-night calls came from people swearing they'd spotted him in distant towns or other states, and I would immediately drive hundreds of miles chasing those faint possibilities, only to encounter strangers with vaguely similar features. Each time my hopes soared briefly before crashing painfully back to reality. The changing seasons brought no change to our frozen existence inside the house. Lester's bedroom stayed precisely as he left it that morning. Boots neatly placed by the bed, jacket draped over the chair, a partially folded shirt waiting eternally. His mother absolutely refused to launder his pillowcase, insisting she could still detect his faint scent there. She spoke gentle words to him every single night, as though he might somehow hear her from wherever he was. I attempted to maintain my job and daily tasks, but everything felt utterly meaningless. The outside world continued spinning forward. Bills arrived regularly. Neighbors carried on conversations. Trains rumbled past in the distance. But within our walls, we remained trapped in time. Every unexpected knock at the door sent my heart racing with possibility. Every telephone ring carried the immense weight of potential answers, but the door always opened to delivery men or neighbors, and the phone always fell silent after a hesitant hello. Police contact grew increasingly infrequent as months dragged on. Their voices became distant and formulaic, assuring us we're still actively looking, even as their eyes conveyed the opposite truth. By our first Christmas without him, the weathered flyers looked exhausted themselves. Rain had blurred Lester's photographed face. Ink had run and faded. Corners curled hopelessly. His mother decorated our tree regardless, carefully hanging his cherished childhood ornaments while whispering quiet prayers over each one. I joined her in pretending everything would soon return to normal, promising aloud that he'd walk through the door any day now with that familiar smile. But privately, I had already begun grieving for a son who might very well still be alive somewhere. Looking back years later, I came to understand that the absolute worst aspect was the endless uncertainty. Death provides a painful but final closure you can eventually learn to bear. Disappearance leaves an open, festering wound that refuses to heal properly. Each new morning forces you to wonder if this will finally be the day hope dies completely. Yet it never does. Hope simply grows softer and more distant over time. One bright spring day, the county sheriff arrived carrying a cardboard box recovered from a forgotten storage unit near the Delaware border. It contained a handful of Lester's old tools, a worn jacket, and a single photograph showing him with an unfamiliar friend. There were no explanations, only heartbreaking reminders of what we'd lost. Following that discovery, the official investigation gradually wound down. The case was eventually classified as inactive, which felt to us like pronouncing death without ever finding a body. His mother never managed to forgive herself for waving goodbye that morning without making him stay. She repeatedly said she should have insisted he take the day off, that perhaps everything would have turned out differently. I reassured her not to torment herself with such thoughts, though I carried the exact same guilt deep inside every single day. The long months after the search officially ended felt like residing inside a colorless old photograph. Our once vibrant home, filled with voices and footsteps and shared laughter, transformed into an empty shell echoing only with silence. His mother gradually stopped preparing proper meals. She would stand motionless at the stove, gripping a wooden spoon before suddenly abandoning the task. Pots would scorch. The tea kettle would shriek unanswered, and she would gaze blankly out the kitchen window as if searching for something stolen from her very soul. I forced myself to keep up appearances, repairing loose boards on the porch, mowing the overgrown lawn, showing up for work shifts. But all of it felt like going through hollow motions. Every piece of furniture, every framed family photo, every hanging coat seemed to be patiently waiting for Lester's return, just as we were. We waited in our separate ways, she with fragile threads of hope, me with mounting layers of guilt and regret. During that first agonizing year, she continued setting 3 full places at the dinner table every evening. She explained that it helped her feel he wasn't truly gone. I never argued or tried to stop her, simply watched in quiet pain as she addressed the empty chair with small comments like, "You look tired today," or "Be sure to bundle up. It's getting cold." Witnessing that ritual tore fresh wounds in me nightly. Yet love compels us to endure even the most heartbreaking behaviors from those we cherish. Neighbors gradually ceased their regular visits. Initially, they arrived frequently bearing homemade casseroles and sincere words of encouragement, urging us never to give up hope. But as weeks stretched into months and then years, those visits became infrequent before stopping altogether. People grow deeply uncomfortable around grief that shows no signs of ending. Eventually, they limited interactions to quick waves from passing vehicles, acting as though everything remained perfectly normal. I never held it against them. The heavy silence filling our home was too much for outsiders to bear alongside us. His mother soon began sleeping exclusively in Lester's old room, claiming she felt closer to him, surrounded by his things. One particularly difficult night, I discovered her sitting on the floor, cradling one of his worn work boots, gently rocking while murmuring words too soft for me to hear. When I attempted to help her stand, she resisted, quietly saying, "Please don't rearrange anything. He needs to recognize his room exactly as he left it." Those words shattered something profound within me that no tears could express. After that evening, I spoke far less often, Words themselves began feeling pointless and inadequate. What could possibly be said that wouldn't ring hollow or false? I eventually took to sleeping in the living room recliner. Our old bed felt far too vast and empty without her beside me. The entire house seemed to age more rapidly than we did. Paint peeling from walls, floorboards creaking louder, windows fogging permanently, unopened mail accumulated in towering piles. Bills were paid weeks late. The once tidy garden overgrown with weeds. Time no longer advanced meaningfully. It merely elongated into a cruel, endless stretch. Then came the painful anniversaries, marking 1 year, then 2, then 5 since his disappearance. We observed each with quiet candlelighting ceremonies and reviewing old family albums. After roughly 8 years passed, she quietly stopped acknowledging those dates altogether. I completely understood her choice. There comes a point where repeatedly reopening the same deep wound becomes unbearable. I remember one quiet evening, perhaps around the 9th year, when she joined me on the porch and tentatively suggested, "Maybe it's time we think about moving somewhere new." But by the very next morning, she had changed her mind entirely, asking, "If we leave this house, how on earth will Lester ever find his way back to us?" And so we remained firmly rooted in place, imprisoned within the same unending pattern of waiting and wondering. Her physical health started declining gradually, not dramatically, but like a flame slowly losing strength. Physicians attributed it to prolonged stress, while I knew it was pure heartbreak eating away at her from within. She smiled far less often, spoke in softer tones, and eventually kept all the curtains tightly closed because even sunlight brought fresh tears. By the time we reached the 12th anniversary, we had become mere shadows drifting through a house overflowing with faded memories. Arguments never arose between us. Anger never surfaced. Only a profound silence so dense that the wall clock's ticking sounded almost mocking in its regularity. The broader world in America continued evolving rapidly around us. Our small town changed with new faces and businesses, but we remained unable to move forward in any way. She still clung to the quiet conviction that Lester would someday return home. I would nod in agreement whenever she said it, even though privately I had mourned him countless times, as if he were already gone forever. Time offers no true healing when absolute truth remains forever out of reach. It merely blunts the sharpest edges of pain until you almost forget what feeling fully alive was like. After his mother finally passed away, the oppressive quiet in the house became truly intolerable. Every room echoed with her absence alongside his. One ordinary afternoon, I packed one small duffel bag and simply walked out the front door without bothering to lock it behind me. There was nothing remaining worth safeguarding anyway. Not the walls, not the memories, certainly not my own broken spirit. I began wandering across the vast American landscape the way grieving men sometimes do when they no longer feel they belong anywhere at all. I took whatever temporary jobs I could find in quiet towns, repairing fences in North Dakota, painting barns in Kansas, splitting firewood in Washington State. Anything that kept my hands occupied enough to somewhat silence my racing thoughts. I stayed in rundown motels reeking of stale cigarette smoke and engine oil, where the only nighttime sounds were humming vending machines and occasional semi-trucks roaring past on nearby interstates. Every new face I encountered blurred together into anonymity. Yet occasionally, I would spot someone with Lester's same broad shoulders or familiar gait, and my heart would momentarily freeze. I'd find myself staring far too long, desperately seeking any recognizable feature. It was never him. Of course. I gradually learned how insidious hope can become, a habit impossible to break even when it continually poisons your peace. Every new location carried its own collection of rumors and sightings. People would mention a quiet man matching Lester's description, working construction in Georgia, or a reserved drifter in Montana claiming partial amnesia. or a long-haul trucker in Utah who once picked up a silent hitchhiker near state lines years ago. I pursued every single lead without hesitation, driving countless thousands of miles across multiple states chasing these elusive shadows. I'd arrive filled with cautious optimism, only to discover yet another stranger and leave even more empty than before. Hope has a cruel way of keeping you alive, primarily to inflict fresh pain repeatedly. I maintained a small leather-bound notebook tucked safely in my jacket pocket. It filled slowly with scribbled notes, town names, exact dates, contact information for individuals who believed they might have crossed paths with him. That notebook became my personal atlas of endless disappointment. I convinced myself that if I simply kept moving indefinitely, eventually fate would place me in the right location at precisely the right moment. But in reality, I had long since stopped genuinely searching for Lester himself. Instead, I was desperately trying to locate the pieces of my own soul that vanished along with him that fateful morning. There were countless lonely evenings spent in small roadside diners where I would sit opposite an empty booth and quietly pretend Lester occupied the seat across from me, sipping hot coffee exactly as he used to. In my mind, I would converse with him, asking where life had taken him, what adventures he'd experienced, why he never once reached out with even a simple letter. No answers ever materialized, but those imagined conversations somehow made the crushing silence slightly more bearable. As full decades slowly accumulated, I mastered the art of living without constant anticipation. I learned to wake each morning without immediately bracing for news, to travel long highways without scrutinizing every pedestrian's face. I learned to carry my profound grief in a small, neatly folded place deep inside where it wouldn't interfere too visibly with daily survival. For nearly 7 years, I worked steadily on a cattle ranch in Colorado. The ranch owner never once pried into my personal history, and I never volunteered any details. Together, we greeted spectacular mountain sunrises each day, and during those peaceful years, I discovered fleeting moments of something resembling inner calm. I largely stopped examining strangers for familiar traits. I nearly persuaded myself that true acceptance might eventually replace the pain. But truthfully, a part of me never fully ceased scanning crowded places, reading every headline, studying every older man who roughly matched what Lester's age would now be. I aged without fully realizing it was happening. My hands developed a noticeable tremor, my knees grew unreliable, but the central question burning in my heart never dimmed. Where are you, my son? When I finally settled into a modest trailer parked on the outskirts of Tucson, Arizona, I was utterly exhausted, not from physical labor but from decades of fruitless searching. The endless roads had offered me nothing except deeper silence, and I had reluctantly learned to coexist with that emptiness. I genuinely believed my long story had reached its conclusion, that Lester had permanently vanished into some remote corner of existence where no amount of parental love could ever reach him. I could not have foreseen that fate still held one final, devastating revelation in store, the most painful of all. The years gradually melted together like slowly dripping candle wax from a flame that refused to extinguish. I ceased tracking time through traditional calendars or personal milestones. Instead, I measured its passage by how profoundly quiet my existence became with each passing season. Telephone calls grew rare. Personal letters stopped arriving entirely. Old acquaintances who once swore eternal connection slowly drifted away into their own lives. Even speaking my own thoughts aloud after days of isolation began making my voice sound unfamiliar and distant. The sole consistent sound remained the relentless desert wind scraping against my thin trailer walls, reminiscent of an aging memory stubbornly refusing to fade completely. His mother had now been gone for well over 25 years, laid to rest beneath a shady maple tree in our old Pennsylvania cemetery. I never managed to attend her funeral service, The idea of standing over her grave while still harboring faint hope that our son might yet be alive somewhere felt utterly impossible to bear. She departed this world still firmly believing Lester would one day return home, smiling exactly as the young man we raised together. Perhaps that steadfast belief granted her some measure of peace in her final days. Perhaps it only deepened her suffering further. I will never know for certain. I developed small daily rituals to fill the vast emptiness, brewing coffee precisely at 6 each morning, turning on the local news broadcast at 7 sharp, taking slow, deliberate walks to check an invariably empty mailbox. I would often sit outside on my trailer steps beneath the fading Arizona sunset, gazing at the vast horizon until everything blurred softly together. My thoughts of Lester grew less piercing over time, or perhaps I simply became better at redirecting them. The once razor-sharp agony of missing him had softened into a dull, constant ache like an ancient scar that still twinges occasionally. Nevertheless, certain nights brought vivid dreams that revived everything. Always the same heartbreaking scene. I would watch Lester walking slowly up our familiar gravel driveway back in Pennsylvania, his old Chevrolet following close behind him. He would raise his hand in greeting, and I would awaken abruptly just before he reached the welcoming porch light. New neighbors moved in and out of nearby trailers over the years, mostly energetic young families beginning exciting new chapters. They would offer friendly waves, address me respectfully as sir, and occasionally inquire about my background. I always shared the same carefully rehearsed gentle fiction, explaining that long ago I had a son named Lester who worked in an auto factory and enjoyed fishing trips, but that he had relocated far away many years earlier. Telling that simplified version proved far easier than revealing the raw truth. Most people simply don't know how to respond when confronted with a parent's story of a child lost to complete silence. On occasion, I would drive into Tucson and settle into a booth at the busy highway diner, ordering strong black coffee and spending hours simply watching vehicles pass on the interstate. Deep down, I think part of me still harbored the impossible fantasy that one random day Lester might walk through those doors, older and weathered certainly, but ready at last to share his long-hidden story and seek reconciliation. That particular brand of stubborn hope is often the very last thing time manages to strip away from a person. During the darkest stretches of loneliness, when the weight felt nearly crushing, I would address the unoccupied chair across my small kitchen table, as though Lester sat there once more. I would update him on mundane details like changing weather patterns, fluctuating gas prices, or major ways America itself had transformed over the decades. In my imagination, he would respond with his characteristic easy laughter, shaking his head affectionately while teasing me for being so old-fashioned. Some might call it madness, but those quiet, one-sided conversations prevented me from completely forgetting the unique sound of his voice. I frequently pondered what sort of adult man he had grown into over the years, whether he had discovered lasting love, if he had children of his own who proudly called him father. Such thoughts simultaneously warmed my heart and deepened the ache within it. I prayed often that wherever life had taken him, even if he no longer spared a single thought for us, he had found genuine happiness and built the fulfilling future his mother always envisioned for him. I aged quietly in that isolated desert existence. My mirror reflection gradually became that of an elderly stranger I barely recognized. Lined and weary, I mastered the skill of living alongside the permanent, unanswered question like a constant but silent companion, always present yet rarely demanding attention. And then, on one completely unremarkable morning, my fragile world shattered all over again. I had the small television tuned to background noise while sipping my routine coffee. I paid little attention until a breaking news headline scrolled urgently across the bottom of the screen. Federal contractor arrested in Arizona on major identity fraud charges. Something about those words immediately drew my full focus. Then the broadcast displayed the suspect's photograph. For several long seconds, I literally forgot how to breathe. The image showed a man being escorted from a courthouse surrounded by flashing cameras and handcuffs clearly visible on his wrists. His hair had turned completely gray. Deep lines etched his face from years past. But I recognized him instantly. Those unmistakable eyes, the distinctive set of his jaw, the subtle way he tightened his mouth to hide emotion. It was undeniably Lester, my son, after 32 long years. My coffee mug slipped from my suddenly numb fingers and shattered loudly on the tile floor. Though the sound barely registered, my heart began pounding so violently I could hear it echoing in my ears. The female reporter's voice continued professionally, though distant, mentioning fragments I struggled to process. Lived under multiple false identities for over 3 decades. Possession of forged passports. Extensive federal investigation. Documented marriage records spanning several states. Each revealed detail struck me like physical blows. The alias name appeared prominently on screen, with smaller text beneath reading. Originally from Pennsylvania, reported missing since 1991. That single line provided absolute confirmation. I leaned forward unsteadily, my trembling finger tracing his televised image on the glass screen as if I could somehow reach through to touch him. He appeared healthy overall, strong even, but carried a visible hardness now, a guarded distance in his expression. The warm, open kindness I remembered in the boy's eyes had been replaced by impenetrable walls built over decades. The anchor continued describing him as quiet and highly disciplined according to interviews with neighbors. A private individual who secured government contracts under carefully constructed assumed identities. He had been married twice, divorced once, with no known children from either union. No children at all. An entire separate existence created without any connection to us. My throat constricted painfully tight. Every comforting theory I had clung to across decades, accident, amnesia, foul play, anything except deliberate choice, instantly collapsed into dust. Lester hadn't been abducted or suffered memory loss or met some tragic end. He had voluntarily chosen to disappear completely, constructing an entirely new life while I spent mine desperately searching scattered remnants of the old one. I switched off the television abruptly, but the ensuing silence proved far more deafening than any broadcast. The emotion surging through me wasn't simple relief or joy. It was overwhelming confusion mixed with profound disbelief and a rising tide of something darker I struggled to name. I stepped outside unently and sat heavily on my trailer steps, staring blankly at the vast desert landscape as if the endless sky might somehow provide desperately needed answers. For hours I remained there motionless, feeling the intense Arizona heat press against my skin while attempting to reconcile the optimistic young man who drove away in 1991 with the guarded stranger now appearing in handcuffs on national news. Somewhere across those intervening years, the son I raised had effectively ceased to exist, transforming not through death, but through deliberate reinvention under another man's name. Later that same evening, I switched the television back on, hoping desperately for additional coverage. The station replayed the same courtroom footage. This time I noticed one brief, heartbreaking instant when Lester glanced directly toward the cluster of cameras. It lasted only a fraction of a second, yet felt inexplicably like he was looking straight through the screen at me, as though he somehow knew I would still be watching after all this time, still waiting. That fleeting moment crystallized the devastating realization. His disappearance had never been accidental or forced upon him. He had made the conscious decision to walk away from us entirely, to build a completely separate existence where his original family held no place whatsoever. The broadcast continued revealing more details, confirming he had operated primarily under the alias Thomas Reed, serving as a private federal contractor with frequent travel requirements. Expertly blending into ordinary society, multiple neighbors described him as consistently polite, yet emotionally distant. Someone who rarely discussed personal matters. One interviewee recalled him casually mentioning years ago that his entire family had tragically passed away long before. Hearing that particular statement felt like being broken cleanly in two. He had actively told strangers that we were dead. I thought immediately of his devoted mother, how she had gone to her own grave, still praying nightly for his safe return, still preparing imaginary birthday cakes each year complete with a single candle. And throughout all those decades, he had been very much alive, deliberately pretending his parents had never existed at all. I walked slowly outside beneath the brilliant star-filled Arizona night sky and spoke aloud to the empty darkness, asking the only question that truly mattered. Why perhaps he had felt hopelessly trapped by small-town expectations and limited opportunities. Perhaps he yearned for adventures and freedoms our simple life couldn't provide. Perhaps he simply desired to become someone entirely different from the person he believed he was destined to be. I could have found ways to forgive almost any explanation. A terrible accident, involvement in crime, even the pain of knowing he simply wanted to escape us. But this deliberate, complete erasure felt fundamentally different and far more devastating. As additional reports emerged throughout the week, the full picture grew painfully clearer. That seemingly ordinary morning in 1991 had actually marked the beginning of his carefully orchestrated exit plan. Perhaps he had spent months preparing in secret, obtaining false documentation, selecting a distant new location, crafting an entirely new identity. I remembered how he used to devour books about undercover agents and people starting life over in witness protection programs. Maybe he genuinely believed total disappearance represented the ultimate path to personal reinvention and safety. And perhaps, in his mind, he had been right all along. News coverage lingered for several days, focusing on the elaborate scale of the identity fraud involved. He had entered 2 separate marriages using fabricated names, produced no children from either relationship, left no trace whatsoever of the young man who once sat at our Pennsylvania kitchen table, promising to care for us in our old age. That long-ago promise now echoed bitterly hollow in my mind. I found myself pacing restlessly inside my small trailer, caught between waves of intense anger and an unexpected, twisted sense of pride. Anger at being so completely erased from his story. Pride that he had somehow managed to survive and construct something substantial on his own terms. Perhaps he believed his actions protected us from some unknown danger I would never comprehend. The most excruciating truth wasn't simply discovering he was alive after all. It was accepting that he had never wanted to be found by us in the first place. For several days following that shocking broadcast, I existed in a fog-like state that felt equally dream and nightmare. I barely ate, barely moved, simply sat beside my silent telephone listening to the relentless desert wind rattle my trailer walls like an unending reminder of time's passage. I desperately needed to see him in person, to hear his voice once more, to look directly into his eyes and ask why he made those choices, even fully aware he might refuse every question. So eventually, I gathered my courage and dialed the federal detention center in Arizona, where reports indicated he was being held. My voice trembled noticeably as I provided his real birth name, Lester, the one I had carried silently in my heart for 32 agonizing years. The officer asked my relationship to the detainee, then placed me on hold for what felt like eternity. When he finally returned to the line, his tone had shifted to something cautious and measured. "Sir," he said gently, "the individual has explicitly declined any contact with persons from his previous life." Those words struck harder than any previous revelation the news had delivered. My chest tightened as I pleaded desperately, explaining that I was his biological father, that his mother had passed away years ago, still waiting faithfully for his return, that I required only 5 brief minutes. No accusations, no demands, just a chance to see him. The line remained silent for several agonizing seconds. I dared to hope perhaps Lester had reconsidered and taken the receiver himself. But then came another quiet sigh, followed by, "I'm truly sorry, sir. He has consistently maintained that his family died many years ago. He insists there has been some mistake in identification." I replaced the receiver slowly, without speaking another word. My entire body trembled, as if the last remaining piece of my world had finally crumbled away. I felt completely hollowed out, officially declared dead by my own flesh and blood. All those decades spent praying for his safety and happiness now seemed bitterly ironic, answered at last with cold, deliberate rejection. I wasn't merely forgotten or abandoned. I had been actively erased from existence in his new reality. That long night I retrieved the dusty old box stored beneath my bed, filled with precious remnants of Lester's childhood, crayon drawings from grade school, old report cards with teachers' comments, a handmade card declaring me the world's greatest dad, in his uneven young handwriting. I traced each faded letter slowly with my fingertip until hot tears blurred everything completely. How could the loving little boy who created that card possibly grow into a man capable of pretending his parents had died while we still lived and grieved? During the weeks that followed, I composed and mailed dozens upon dozens of heartfelt letters addressed to the detention facility. In them, I assured him I harbored no burning anger, that I offered full forgiveness even without understanding his reasons, that he would forever remain my son regardless of whatever name he chose to live under. None were ever returned undelivered. Yet no response ever arrived either. Perhaps he read my words carefully. Perhaps he destroyed every page unread. The possibility that I would never know haunted me deeply. Media attention gradually faded as expected, replaced swiftly by newer scandals and tragedies demanding public focus. Eventually, I learned through brief reports that Lester had been released pending further legal proceedings, only to disappear once again shortly afterward. This time, however, his vanishing carried no mystery whatsoever. It was purely intentional choice. My son was indeed alive and free somewhere in the world. Yet in every meaningful way, he remained as lost to me as ever. I once believed the ultimate human suffering was losing a child entirely. Experience has now taught me something far more devastating. Discovering that child deliberately chose to sever every tie and walk away forever. Lester left for work one ordinary morning, and I effectively buried him in my heart that very same night. For 32 endless years, I carried his precious memory like an unhealed wound, constantly reopening, only to finally learn that while I mourned and searched tirelessly, he had been living fully, breathing fresh air, perhaps even laughing freely somewhere distant under another identity and another sky entirely. There exists no adequate word for this particular brand of grief. It transcends both death and ordinary separation, becoming instead a living ghost that resides permanently within your soul, refusing any form of release. Some quiet late nights I still imagine potential conversations if he ever unexpectedly appeared at my door. I wouldn't demand detailed explanations or justifications. I would simply tell him how his mother never once stopped loving him deeply, even as illness claimed her life, that she kept his favorite photograph beside her bed until her final breath, that I buried her wearing the simple silver watch he proudly gave her for Mother's Day when he was just 14 years old. I would explain how every major decision I made after his disappearance was profoundly shaped by the enormous void he left behind. And perhaps, in that imagined moment, he might finally comprehend the true lifelong cost of his prolonged silence. Certain mornings I awaken briefly, forgetting the painful truth that he is alive somewhere, momentarily believing my old comforting narrative that he was taken unwillingly and needed rescue. But harsh reality quickly floods back. He never called out for me, never intended to return. That brutal knowledge weighs far heavier than any physical tombstone ever could. I no longer harbor active blame toward him. Perhaps he desperately needed escape from burdens I will never fully grasp. The limitations of small-town Pennsylvania life. The kind of father I was capable of being. A future that felt suffocatingly narrow for his dreams. Perhaps he always planned to return eventually after establishing himself. But time has an unforgiving way of solidifying distances between people once created. Maybe 1 year stretched into 5, then 10, then 32 full decades, until facing the accumulated consequences became impossible. I will go to my own grave without ever knowing his true motivations. And that permanent unknown may prove the heaviest burden of all. I still occasionally speak aloud to the version of Lester I carry inside. Not the hardened man from recent news reports, but the joyful boy I actually raised. The child who raced his bicycle down our quiet country road. Who laughed uproariously at his mother's silly stories. Who frequently dozed off on our couch still wearing muddy shoes after long days playing outside. That pure, innocent version of my son continues to exist vividly within my memories. And perhaps for now, that fragile connection must be enough to sustain me. I have long since ceased chasing random rumors or anxiously checking the mailbox for impossible letters. The lonely desert highway stretching past my trailer remains empty in both directions for miles. I have painfully accepted that certain life stories simply lack neat resolutions or comforting closures. Some merely fade gradually into quiet obscurity until only one aging person remains alive to recall how everything originally began. People often claim time eventually heals all wounds. It does not. Time merely teaches you how to bear unimaginable pain without visibly flinching. How to offer polite smiles to strangers while secretly carrying an entire private cemetery within your chest. Time instructs you that genuine love never truly ends. It only transforms into something far quieter, something only your own heart can still clearly hear. If Lester is still out there somewhere and ever happens to encounter this account, perhaps he will immediately recognize my voice, the same steady voice that once called him home each evening for warm supper. Maybe certain details will stir long-buried memories. The familiar creak of our old screen door swinging open, the comforting aroma of his mother's home cooking, the profound weight of the family life he consciously left behind. And maybe, just maybe, he will finally comprehend what 32 years of chosen silence actually cost everyone involved. My son left for work one ordinary morning and never came home again. 32 years later, I saw his face appear suddenly on the news. Alive, certainly. Much older. Living completely as another person entirely. The world now knew him exclusively by a stranger's name. But I recognized immediately that he would always be my Lester deep down. And even now, after enduring everything, if he ever found the courage to knock on my humble trailer door, I would open it without a moment's hesitation. He vanished once long ago as my beloved boy, only to painfully reappear decades later as an unrecognizable stranger. But even total strangers sometimes carry faint shadows and echoes of exactly who they once were.